Hello, and welcome to Cutting Through. I'm Mitchell Plitnick. Coming to talk to you today about the op-ed that appeared yesterday, which was December 1st, in the New York Times by Ben Rhodes, who is formerly the Deputy National Security Advisor under Barack Obama, and has since been a fairly leading uh, Democratic pundit on foreign policy. Rhodes is among the best of the what I would call the mainstream Democrat commentators. He offers a pretty good analysis of a lot of issues, including Israel-Palestine. He is not reluctant to admit where he and the Obama administration were wrong, although I think he looks back on his time there as, well, certainly better than what came after it, and I think that much is fair at least. Um, but this op-ed that he wrote is, I think, really important. It's it really does nail the Democrats on their complete failure on Israel Palestine and how much it's cost them politically. But he doesn't overly dwell on that. I think he uses that more as a tool to convince people to change. He mostly focuses on the fact that it's bad policy, and I think that's powerful. And he pretty much eviscerates Joe Biden on his approach to Gaza and the genocide, and he's not he doesn't go too lightly on Israel either. He's Jewish. I think he would describe himself as basically pro-Israel in the sense of being willing to be critical, but also supporting Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, which I think puts him pretty firmly in like the J Street camp, which is not my camp. But he does so in a sensible way. And I think both the good and the bad in that of that come out uh, in his op-ed. So one thing that that I think is notable and kind of um, needs to be explored and looked at carefully is his basic approach that not only was this that has is the Democrats' current stance realistically on Israel and Palestine bad policy, but it's also bad politics. The way he ended his op-ed is where I'm going to start right now. As you can see here, he says that many Democrats will never embrace the views on Israel of Zohran Mamdani, New York's mayor-elect, who I think it's fair to describe as explicitly anti-Zionist. But one reason New Yorkers believed he would fight to lower costs is that they knew he had core convictions. His willingness to be pilloried by powerful people about his views on Israel, including President Trump and some of his billionaire backers, showed that he was not afraid to stand up for his beliefs. By contrast, the familiar pandering to pro-Israel voters by Mr. Mamdani's main opponent in the mayoral race, Andrew Cuomo, including volunteering for Mr. Netanyahu's legal defense team, did not come across as particularly courageous or authentic. A renewed Democratic Party must be rooted in a moral vision that is all too absent in the world. Sometimes to win, you must show that there are principles for which you are prepared to lose. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. There's a lot of truth in it. Um, I don't think Ben Rhodes is in any way saying he shares Zohran Mamdani's views on Israel-Palestine, which I think, shows the difference also between my own views on Israel-Palestine and Ben Rhodes. But he is making a point that I've made frequently over the course of the last year, since the election in 2024, is that, yes, the Democrats' stance on Gaza cost Kamala Harris in the election. One can say it cost the election, but it wasn't only because people disagreed about the position on Gaza. It was because Harris showed that she was not listening to her own voters, and very clearly by her stance demonstrating when all the polls were showing that that Democratic voters overwhelmingly wanted us to stop supporting what Israel was doing in Gaza, and Harris refused to say she would do that. She not only was disagreeing with them, she was not only showing that she was showing that she didn't care what her own constituents thought. So she wasn't only showing that she was tone deaf and removed from those constituents, she was showing that she didn't care about that reality. Nobody could have missed this. Kamala Harris is a professional politician. The Democrats are nothing if not focus group focused. They knew what the numbers said. They knew what the voters said. They went ahead and did this anyway. And I think this is one of the things that Rhodes is pointing out. It's not just a political question. It's a question of how people perceive their own vote being used. People perceive that their vote was being taken for granted and that, yes, you'll vote for me, but I won't do a damn thing that you want me to do. That's the message Harris was sending out, even though, of course, there are clearly things that almost any Democratic voter would have wanted her to do that would have certainly at least been different from Trump. Um, but but I think that's the message that she sent, and people heard it. And people heard a very different message from Mamdani. Mamdani sent by standing against Israel's actions in Gaza, even people who may have thought he was wrong about that, or maybe even just a little off base on that point, saw that he was going to stand by his convictions. He was going to say what he believed was true, and he was going to put it out there and say, you're going to vote for me based on who I am, or you're not. And I'm going to be who I am if you vote for me. And that is not what Democrats generally say. Not just Kamala Harris. This has been true for many, many years with the Democrats. And I think that's what Ben Rhodes is pointing to. And it's what I've been saying for a year. And somehow that just, that just seems to have gotten lost. And I think this is what Rhodes is pointing out. And he's pointing out how Gaza was the very icon of this flawed democratic behavior and the reason why the Democrats lost. Now, I have some other reservations about some of the stuff um, that 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 uh, that Rhodes included in his op-ed. But I think on the whole, this message that he was sending out was an important one. It's not my personal message. It's not my exact politics. And I think many people in the Palestine solidarity movement will find that they have disagreements with at least some of the framing. And I'll get into some of those in a bit. But this is a former, fairly senior official in the Barack Obama administration writing in the New York Times. This message is really important for people to hear. Earlier in the op-ed, Rhodes wrote, "It is past time for Democrats to stop supporting this Israeli government. By letting go of an outdated approach, Democrats can reclaim their values, foster a bigger and more stable coalition, and start building the world they want rather than defending the indefensible." I think this is probably where I had my biggest problem with Rhodes' framing. But again, a problem I very much understand. Look, a guy like him in his position with his politics and in the New York Times, there's only so far that he's going to go. And even if the Times would publish it, it just wouldn't land with a lot of people if he went further than he can go, then he would want to go. I think Rhodes is being sincere. But I'm not looking for the moon here. I'm not looking for everything. I'm looking for progress and for somebody to tell the Democrats to slap him in the face and wake up. And I think that is what Rhodes is doing. But he does here reinforce a dangerous idea that it's this Israeli government, that somehow this Israeli government is different. Now, there's a train of thought among anti-Zionists, which I will remind people I do not call myself, although the politics are pretty much identical in many ways. But there's a train of thought among anti-Zionists that this Israeli government is just what Israel's always been with the mask up. And there's a certain truth to that in the sense that that previous Israeli governments always were image conscious and they wouldn't take certain steps because they thought A, the world wouldn't tolerate them, and B, they were trying to maintain support among liberal elites in the United States and Europe. But I disagree with that. Israeli society, Israeli culture, which I'm very familiar with, um, really started, I mean, it shifted. There was an idealism in Israel that never extended to the Palestinians. There was always denial about the Palestinians. There was always sort of the way Israelis sort of saw themselves, and the way Israel supporters around the world, particularly on the left, saw themselves and saw Israel in the 50s, the 60s, and some of the 70s. Um, and there was always a disconnect when it came to the Palestinians, a sharp disconnect. Um, that and it was a disconnect that at that time was easier to maintain even for Israelis because they didn't see as much of it. Even Israelis for whom Palestinian refugees were literally on their doorstep, um, they didn't see it as much as they do today. And it was of a different quality. I mean, I know I've heard from many older Israelis, telling stories about how they used to, even after the occupation started, they would go to the West Bank, they would have, dinner in Palestinian restaurants. They had friends, but, a lot that changed through the years quite dramatically, that there was even that sector in Israel. And there was always, of course, the far right strain, pretty much from the beginning. But Israel has changed over the years, and that is fair. But it's too much to say that it's all about this government. There were so many horrific war crimes that were connected to not only the occupation that started in '67, but the Nakba of 47 to 49, and the generally colonialist attitude. And I know some people don't like that word, but that's what it was, and it was called such by you know, such famous anti-Zionists as Zev Jabotinsky, Chaim Weizmann, David Ben-Gurion, all those anti-Zionists. They called it a colony. They called it colonization. Yosef Weitz called it a colonization. Um, they understood what they were doing. So you can deny it all you want, but I mean, this is what Zionism was and is. Um, the so that change happened, but let's not make out that the seeds of this weren't always there. Just always the seeds of what we've seen in the last couple of years were not always there. That it did take a series of events, including one big trigger, to really set them off. But and the conditions had to be right, and the right conditions were this ultra right wing government. But Israel's been moving in this direction for a long time, since the late '70s for sure. And and it's been a more or less steady move to the right in all of that time. So I resist when people like Rhodes overstate how much this government is an anomaly. It's not. It's not an anomaly historically, and it's not an anomaly going forward. There is no reason to think, and every reason not to think, that Israel is going to do something differently, that it's suddenly going to shift back to say there used to be this theory that Israel kind of moved, kind of like a pendulum, that it swung a bit right, swung a bit left, and that really wasn't true. I mean, it was a labor government country for its first 3 decades, and once Likud broke that monopoly in the late '70s, yes, it wasn't like an immediate bing. It was everything was right wing. That was when elections started moving back and forth, but also labor started moving closer to if you want to call it, the center of Israeli politics, or the right of Israeli politics. Um, it had to do that because that was where the Israeli society was going, and that's how you get this sort of back and forth labor and Likud governments for many years, until until Netanyahu's takeover, um, the in the late 2000s, which was already, labor had already been decimated by then. Likud had moved from being the ruling party to a minority party, but Kadima had replaced Labor, and Kadima was explicitly not a left-wing party; it was explicitly a centrist party. So that the shift of the Overton window was moving rightward already, and the back and forth on the elections was just a symptom of that. So that theory about the pendulum was never accurate. The Rhodes went on to say that um, While the support which he's described in previous paragraphs, support for some of Israel's more idealistic aspects, the concept of the kibbutz and the socialism and all of that, and he says, and to his credit, at least he acknowledges this. While the support over often overlooked Palestinian displacement, it has become harder for politicians today to square the story they tell about Israel with the reality of a right-wing government determined to block the emergence of a Palestinian state and to annex the West Bank. So again, Rhodes is talking about how this government is kind of unique and special and has somehow changed Israel, or Israel has changed and the government is reflecting that. Either way, um, he minimizes, I think. He still idealizes the way Israel used to be, and I think he's minimizing just how much they were ignoring the Palestinians. I can say, and I remember growing up in the 70s and in my early adult years in the 80s, um, Palestinians the Palestinians were the PLO. They were the Black September group. They were various militant groups who were always carrying out acts of terrorism. Um, and I didn't hear much else, or really anything else, about Palestinian people until the First Intifada, which started to change the way Palestinians were seen in the world. But in the West, we didn't know from Palestinians except as terrorists. That's all we heard. And um, that had a profound impact, and so when Palestinians suddenly were human beings and presented as human beings in the West, that made a big difference. And I think looking back on that, what we understand, or what I think we should understand, is that lack, not just lack of seeing Palestinians humanity, but lack of seeing Palestinians at all, is what enabled an idealized version of Israel to have some echo in reality. The idealized version of Israel that I was certainly brought up on, that you can go to Israel now, you won't see it. It doesn't exist. It didn't really exist then, but there were aspects of it that did. Um, and there were enough that since you didn't see Palestinians on the whole, um, you could buy into a lot more of it. And I think it's much more difficult now. And I think Rhodes does himself and his readers a disservice by minimizing that. It was one of my big issues with this op-ed, which again, uh, doesn't detract from what I think it was a very positive op-ed on the whole. So Rhodes moves on and really now focuses on the Biden administration, a bit on the Obama administration, but basically we could say the last 10 or so years of American policy towards Israel. And he says, in the battle between democracy and autocracy that shadowed the Biden presidency, it was clear what side Mr. Netanyahu was on. Following a now familiar authoritarian playbook, he clamped down on civil society, attacked independent media, embraced an increasingly violent settler movement, and tried to neuter Israeli courts, prompting huge protests. Let's also say Rhodes puts that in the past tense. There ain't no past tense about it. That's going on right as we speak. The centerpiece of Biden's Mideast policy remained the Abraham Accords, particularly an initiative to bring Saudi Arabia into the arrangement without the creation of a Palestinian state. Let's talk about that for a minute, because Biden's initiative for Saudi Israeli normalization uh, did absolutely follow on the Abraham Accords, which was a Trumpian deal that completely sidelined the Palestinians. And it remains stunning to me. This is all now before October 7th. So it remains stunning to me that nobody in Biden's administration, either nobody realized or nobody was able to get through to the president how bad the Abraham Accords actually were. I think it bugged Biden to no end that Donald Trump, and worse, Donald Trump's nephew, had been able to broker this deal that normalized relations between Israel and particularly the United Arab Emirates, which was a lot less of an accomplishment, really, than I think Biden might have seen it as. The UAE, unlike Saudi Arabia, is quite single-mindedly focused on its own uh, uh, its own economic interests and strategic interests. Saudi Arabia has other interests that involve leadership of the Muslim world, that involved its position in the Arab world, and particularly its custodianship of over Islam's holiest sites. Um, that matter, and the UAE has none of that. So I mean, the UAE, it's a transactional country that really, it really wasn't that hard to sell, and you can see how cheap it really came because the UAE paid some lip service to look, we can, we stopped Israel from annexing the West Bank, which is nonsense. They weren't going to do that. Trump wasn't going to allow it. Um, and there was, these are sold as peace agreements, which they were not. Neither the UAE nor Bahrain nor Sudan nor Morocco, none of those countries have ever been at war with Israel. So they didn't have normal relations. That's not the same thing as being at war. Um, Biden was obsessed with that, and it remains to me, and I reported on it quite a bit. If you go back and look through the archives of the things that I wrote in the first half of Joe Biden's administration, his obsession with Saudi normalization and his indifference to Palestinian statehood on that regard. The only reason he even considered Palestinian statehood as part of that is because the Saudis insisted that they couldn't do it unless there was some accommodation on the Palestinians. And instead of trying to press Israel to compromise, Biden pressed Saudi Arabia to lower its standards, which the Saudis were in the process of doing. I can maintain to this day this was a key factor in the decision to launch the October 7th the October 7th attack. So it is really stunning to me that was Biden's obsession, that nobody either wanted to or either saw the danger there or was able to prevail upon Biden to back off of that obsession of his. Um, Rhodes goes on, I think, here to a place, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think it's worth a mention that he says, then came October 7th. Suddenly, American Jews were confronted by images of a pogrom in southern Israel and the shadow of rising anti-Semitism in the United States coming from the far right and the far left. Here is maybe my big, and it's just the one short paragraph of two sentences. But here's maybe my biggest problem with Rhodes' op-ed, because he reinforces more myths here, and he reinforces particularly problematic ones and frankly dangerous ones with his words here. First, he calls October 7th a pogrom. Technically speaking, I suppose you could call it a pogrom in the sense that it was an attack directed at a group based on who the group was, based on, uh, based on them being Israeli. Although the implication here, and although Rhodes doesn't make this explicit, but it's a clear implication by the not only by the use of the word, but certainly also by the way most, I'd say the overwhelming majority of American Jews saw this attack. It was an attack on Jews. And I have said this from literally from that day till now. It was not an attack on Jews. It was an attack on Israelis. And while most Israelis are Jews, the people who were attacked for being Israeli, which is illegitimate and illegal and not acceptable in any way. This was an attack. It was a war crime. It was far in excess of what the legitimate right to resistance covers for an occupied people. Okay, that much is clear, but it was not an attack on Jews as Jews, which to me is the implication of pogrom. When we talk about a pogrom, and pogrom is a word that has expanded, but it originated with attacks primarily in Russia, in the Russian Empire, primarily in the Pale of Settlement, against Jewish communities there. So it was an attack by an oppressive government on a minority and helpless people, which does not describe the situation between Hamas, which is barely a government, in any real sense and is not acknowledged as a government by anybody outside of Palestine, and Israel, which is clearly the far more powerful party. To me, this would be more something in line of the kind of revolts that we've seen against slavers, against French in Algeria, that sort of thing, which were problematic at times. And we can have that conversation. But pogrom implies that it was an attack um, on helpless people as a means of oppression, which is really what pogroms were, as opposed to an oppressed people lashing out in a way that, again, I'll stress it again, was a war crime, was illegitimate, and was very, very serious, and was far beyond anything that the oppressed people had a right to do under the internationally protected right of resistance. Nonetheless, to call it a pogrom, I think, goes too far. And then Rhodes compounds the problem by talking about the shadow of rising anti-Semitism in the United States coming from the far right and the far left. Look, this isn't a simple question. And I've had to argue, frankly, and I'm guilty of it as well, of arguing about it on a too simplistic level. I see some of the stuff that's said about Jews. Um, I see it far more from the right than I do from the left, far more. And putting it creating this equivalence that Rhodes does here is completely off base. It just isn't true. It's only true if you collapse anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Okay, both of which, by the way, you'll see on both the right and the left, not just the far right and the far left. You see it throughout. You will see anti-Zionism. You see racism, sexism, etc. The left is not immune to that. The difference between the right and the left is that the left is ideologically opposed to it, so that it is a failure of its own ideals when individually or even collectively any of that stuff shows up, and it does. It's not easy to overcome societal prejudice, but it's part of who the right wing is. It's part of right wing ideology. And we losing that distinction means pretending things are other than what they are. And like the right loves to say, facts don't care about your feelings. Things are what they are. These are right wing issues. And in fact, many of the times that I have seen in progressive movements or in the Palestine solidarity movement, anti-Semitism crop up, it's been in the form of right wing talking points. Pernicious Jewish control of blah 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 and things of that nature. So it's seeing displays, and I did a piece recently on this, of or at least I maybe it was just a social media post about a display in Washington nearby to me, where it was a bunch of the world's leading Zionists sitting down to a table, drinking the blood of Palestinians, and using anti-Semitic tropes. Unnecessary. We can talk about how horrible the genocide is without that sort of shit. So it's there, but this equivalence that Rhodes draws here, while I'm sure it plays to his audience, is nonsense, and reinforcing it is dangerous, and it is dangerous propaganda, because we have to be able to talk about Israel very clearly, and we have to be able to talk about Israeli crimes very clearly, and we have to be able to talk about anti-Semitism very clearly, as well as anti-Palestinian racism. We need to be able to talk about all of those things, and they all need to be put in their contexts of how big a problem they are, how real a problem they are, and they need to not be used in contexts where they don't apply. Criticism of Israel, even harsh criticism of Israel, and this very much includes debating whether an ethnocratic, settler colonial apartheid state has a right to exist as such, that is not anti-Semitism. You could say Israel does have a right to exist that way. That's fine. That's a debate we can have. But it's not anti-Semitism to suggest otherwise. So that line, and it's worth noting that it's one line out of a pretty long op-ed that I really did find intensely problematic from Rhodes. In another spot, Rhodes is very, very clearly, criticizing Joe Biden's Gaza policy. But he also gets, he gets a little bit too apologetic, I think, in what he says. He said, few Democrats embraced Israel's conduct, but many chose to emphasize a story of Palestinian terrorism and rejection of peace. That instinct is part of the problem. Yes, Yasser Arafat was a difficult interlocutor at the 2000 Camp David summit. Does that justify the relentless displacement of Palestinians in the West Bank ever since? Yes, Hamas has engaged in abhorrent acts of terrorism. Does that warrant dropping 2,000-pound U.S. made bombs on refugee camps full of children? I want to really look at this because here's where I think Rhodes falls into a familiar trap, and I can't excuse this by him just pandering to his audience. And I will qualify it by saying he's saying this in the context of how Democrats sort of self-justified um, going along with Biden's policies. Um, Even though he's being critical of that. He's being critical of the policies, and he's being critical of Democrats having gone along with it. So I do think that's important to keep in mind. But in doing so, um, he talks about Arafat being difficult at the 2000 Camp David summit. Was Arafat difficult? Yes. Arafat had a way of trying to appease the American president and the Israeli prime minister who was trying to work with at the time, Ehud Barak, while telling Palestinians in Arabic that he was, standing strong against pressure from the Americans and the Israelis. And there were real mixed messages, especially when it came to the most sensitive issues, which were the question of Jerusalem and the question of Palestinian refugees. And he was kind of talking about out both sides of his mouth, and it created difficulties, and it created a real difficulty for him when the U.S. and Israel said, "Look, here's the offer, to take it. We're at the take it or leave it point," because both of them were looking at losing their jobs. One just being aged out in Clinton, the other being voted out in Barack. Um, so Arafat did do some things wrong there. But let's also remember that when we talk about the Camp David summit, Arafat did not want to go to the Camp David summit. He did not think the situation was ready, was ripe for that kind of summit. He knew there was a lot of resentment boiling in the Palestinian territories at the time, and he knew that he was not going to be able to make the kind of compromises that the U.S. and Israel were going to demand, while he also understood, I think, that from the at least from the Israeli point of view, if not also from the American point of view, what Barak was prepared to offer was in fact far more than any Israeli prime minister had offered before him. So there was going to be a real disconnect there because Barak's so-called generous offer was still far short of the minimum the Palestinians would have accepted. And they would not have accepted Arafat agreeing to this. There would have been the very revolt that happened. Just might have been directed a little bit more at the Palestinian Authority than it was as matters played out. So I think pushing for this, again, the implication that Rhodes is coming to here is the one that Robert Malley and Hussein Agha, right away after Camp David, tried to prevent from taking hold and have tried to dispel ever since, which is that Israel offered almost everything, and the Palestinians said, no, that's not what happened. It was not the case. There were real problems in terms of what the minimums that Palestinians needed and maximums that Israelis could offer. There was a major gap there, and it wasn't being appreciated by the more powerful side, which was, of course, the U.S. and Israel. Then he talks about Hamas has engaged in abhorrent acts of terrorism. Look, I've already described what Hamas did on October 7th, and it's certainly not the only one. That being said, um, this is again the kind of question and the kind of point that is so deeply problematic because it looks at, well, Hamas is committing these terrible acts. How many Palestinians have been killed? Forget October 7th. Go back before October 7th. The destruction, the fatalities, the children killed, the non-combatants killed, the acts of torture, of arbitrary imprisonment, of land confiscation, of devastated lives. There's no comparison in the violence that Palestinians have done to Israelis and Israelis have done to Palestinians. And both sides will tell you. So I don't want to hear this argument. And frankly, I don't want to hear this argument from either, from any, that it's because of what the other side did. They started it. Didn't work in second grade, doesn't work now. It doesn't, none of this can be legally justified to the extent that you can argue that Israel has to take some steps to secure the safety of its citizens. I agree. Some of those steps should be freeing the Palestinians and giving them their rights and taking away the reasons for these attacks. That would be the most effective way, you know. But again, the issue is, I mean, you just have to look at any of the reports from any human rights organization over the years before October 7th, 2023. The difference is monumental, literally monumental. I mean, there's just no comparison between the level of violence that Israelis have perpetrated compared to that of Palestinians, justified or unjustified. The difference is enormous, and the fact is that most of it is unjustified from the Israeli side. You know, we have arbitrary arrests. We have people being thrown in and kept in horrific prison conditions for months and months without charge, without due process, for no explicit reason, other than they might have known somebody who was once a member of a Palestinian militant group 30 years ago. For all we know, we have no idea. It could be just nothing. They might have looked at Israeli soldiers the wrong way. We don't know. So, you know, it's nice to say that the acts that Palestinians have committed does not justify the response that Israel has taken since October 7th, but it completely decontextualizes all of that violence. Okay, because again, it thrusts it into Palestinians to do something, and Israel responds, oh, they overreacted. It's not that. It is not that at all. That's the implication here, that Israel just overreacts and overreacts. Yes, it's way bad overreaction. It's killing children. It's terrible. It must be condemned. But there was a reason Israel did it. No, there was not. There was not. And even if we want to go after October 7th, as much as, look, we can talk about international law. We can talk about any country would indeed respond in some violent way to what happened on October 7th. Okay, we know this. That's fine. But Israel didn't do what any country would do. Israel didn't go. Israel didn't go after Hamas. They never intended to go after Hamas. Israel went after the Palestinian civilian population in an unprecedented way from minute one. From the second Yoav Gallant made his proclamation, he made it very clear. He was not going after Hamas. He was going after the people of Gaza. Yitzhak Herzog reinforced that when he said there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. So this is not so here is where I will take Rhodes to task a bit, because he's perpetuating some very, very dangerous myths that are unacceptable, and we have to move away from them, not move towards them, even if we're talking about a situation where we need to somewhat pander to our audience. But here, I think, is where, Rhodes gets on his strongest grounds, which is political arguments. So he says, if you believe a Palestinian child is equal in dignity and worth to an Israeli or American child, it is no longer possible to support this Israeli government while hiding behind platitudes about peace. Now, again, problematic that it's this Israeli government. There needs to be a record. We don't have to look. I'm not looking for anybody to say, as I sometimes do, and I don't think it's particularly useful, Israel's the most evil thing that ever existed. Okay, I'm not looking for that. I don't think that is either realistic or true either. But also, not necessary. What is necessary is reality. It is not just this Israeli government. These crimes have been going on since 1948 and even longer through successive Israeli governments without a break. It's never changed. So he needs to stop doing this. Nonetheless, where he's going here is a good place. Polls have shown that only a third of Democrats have a favorable view of Israel, down from 73% in 2014. We should really take a look at that. Just stop and think. That is incredible. That is an amazing turnaround. Okay, you're talking about from 73% down to I think the number that I saw was 31% that have a favorable view of Israel. I mean, that is in 11 for in 11 years, especially considering how steady support for Israel among Democrats had been before that. That is stunning, absolutely stunning. It really shows you that Israel just completely jumped the shark and threw away any degree of caring about its image among liberals. This is, I think 2014 is a good line to hold because that was when Netanyahu really just abandoned the whole sham of supporting a two-state solution. And I think that really made more Americans realize Israel is not interested in peace. Majorities of Americans opposed providing military assistance to the Israeli government this summer, and 77% of Democrats agree that a genocide has taken place in Gaza. Again, stunning. 77%, despite the amount, the appalling and abhorrent amount of genocide denial that we see going on all around us every day, including from elected Democratic officials. Looking at you, John Fetterman. But you're not the only one. Uh, the that number is stunning, absolutely stunning. It should be 100% because this is an obvious genocide, the most obvious genocide as it's happening in history. Because remember, other genocides, we didn't know. People didn't know what was happening in the camps in World War II. They found out really quick right after, but for the most part, people did not know. People didn't know what was happening in Armenia. People didn't know. People knew right after the fact what happened in Rwanda. But while it was going on, all we knew was people were fighting. No genocide before has been so thoroughly documented in real time as it happens. And let's remember, people like to say, "Oh, it's Palestinians uploading and faking this and doing that." Half what we know comes from Israeli soldiers in Gaza celebrating the genocide. So let's cut the crap here. More than 60% of American Jews agree that Israel committed war crimes against Palestinians in Gaza, even though a large majority believe that Israel's existence is vital. Now, that's a separate conversation, but just consider the fact that 60% of American Jews agree that Israel committed war crimes. I mean, just sit with that for a minute. That's, again, a truly stunning number. It's unprecedented in American politics. Rhodes continues on to say that it's not healthy for a party to be this out of step with its voters and stated beliefs. And I think it's good that he says stated beliefs because in practice, Democrats, and it's not just when it comes to Israel at all, but Democrats in practice have not been on foreign policy issues very much better than most Republicans, although the craziness that Trump's engaged in now is different, maybe on a different level. The simplest thing to do would be the right thing. Refuse to provide military assistance to the government that has committed war crimes. Support the International Criminal Court in its work, whether it's focused on Vladimir Putin or Benjamin Netanyahu. Oppose any effort by Israel to annex the West Bank or ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip. Invest in an alternative Palestinian leadership from Hamas that can ultimately govern a Palestinian state. Stand up for democracy in Israel as in the United States. Most of those are simply a matter of following stated American policy of decades of duration and American law. Okay, we're not supposed to be allowed to arm war criminals. Okay, American law says we cannot send weapons to Israel, period, done, end of case. That's what the U.S. law says. Can't do it. Okay, realistically, we know it's going to stop. Now, the one point that bears a little bit of investigation here is investing in an alternative Palestinian from Hamas. Look, as long as we don't in any way interfere with elections, it's fine, I think, to work with Palestinian groups who want to promote real democracy. Hamas is certainly not that. Hamas is, in terms of their governing, was not popular. Even to this day, while Hamas is the most popular of the existing parties, there's a lot of skepticism about Hamas, and it says something that Hamas's popularity is higher in the most recent poll by a good 10%, I think, higher in the West Bank than it is in Gaza, higher among those who didn't actually have to live under Hamas. Hamas is an authoritarian uh, uh, regime that has abused human rights, though not as badly as the Palestinian Authority. Um, I'm talking just among Palestinians here. Um, So, if we want to support Palestinian civil society in their efforts, which are very real and ongoing, and there are things that we could be supporting that are completely legitimate for us to support in Palestine that are trying to build a democratic Palestinian society, and a democratic Palestinian government, great. Let's do that. If it's just about getting Hamas out, that's where Palestinians get their backs up. And in fact, many Palestinians who do not like Hamas get their backs up about this because it's not our business. Okay. People in Gaza also understand something that, in 2006, when Palestinian elections were held, Abbas was worried that Fatah was going to lose those elections. The United States was actually the party that was most insistent on holding them because at that time everything was about democracy promotion under the George W. Bush administration. And when we didn't like the outcome, we worked with Fatah in Israel to overthrow Hamas in Gaza, and we failed. And that's why Fatah has no significant presence or a significant influence in the running of Gaza anymore, or didn't for all those years. So the the issue for Palestinians is they don't want to see us continuing to mess with their politics, which is reasonable because it never ends well when we do that. So, I think Rhodes needs to think this one through a little further, but I don't see a problem if we want to support real Democrats I mean Democrats with a small d, real the civil society groups that are working for a democratic, just and legitimate Palestinian government, which is the last thing the United States or Israel really wants to see. But if we want to do that, I'm all for it. Rhodes then says that there must be a big tent over the movement to restore American democracy, but that movement cannot succeed if it is beholden to groups like AIPAC that finance far-right politics. Look, Rhodes touches on AIPAC a few times in this, and I don't. This would be his own video, so I'm not going to go too far into it. But um, many people read this and just say, "See, AIPAC did it all." No, AIPAC didn't do it all. Not, and that isn't at all what Rhodes said. Okay, Rhodes talked about places where AIPAC had influence, which is in Congress and in electoral politics. And that has to be taken into account. That is not the be all and end all of policymaking, as Rhodes himself is arguing. And I think Rhodes makes a very strong case that the Democrats will be, even if the Democrats don't get as much money in total from shunning AIPAC, because if they shun AIPAC, they will get more money from other sectors. But if they truly shun AIPAC, they may not get quite as much money, but they'll get more votes. And he's right about that. And that, money in politics, the only good money does in terms of elections is how many votes it gets. Now, if you're going to talk corruption, yes, these politicians, get assurances that they're going to do, $100,000 speaking engagements, et cetera, once they're out of office, blah, blah, blah. But AIPAC's not doing that nearly as much as Goldman Sachs. That's a problem throughout our electoral systems. Nothing special there about AIPAC. But I think that Rhodes is correct that if we are really going to fight fascism, which is what Trump is bringing us, that we can't do it while taking money from AIPAC. And I think there are Democrats more and more who are realizing that, although What we're seeing is that they're trying to not take money from like APAC pack, but they might take money from a connected pack or from individual donors and things of that nature. So it's a more complicated problem than that. But look, this, and I'll tell you this a million times over. Joe Biden's moves on Gaza, that was not APAC. That was Joe Biden from the very beginning. So Rhodes continues to say there's anti-Semitism amid Israel's critics that must be condemned, but the charge is now applied so broadly that it is being debased. This normalizes vile conspiracy theories about Jews by lumping them together with legitimate critiques of Israeli policy. I mean, we have to thank Rhodes for saying that. I think there's no question. That is a clear statement. It's well put about the dangers of the idealization of anti-Semitism, which virtually defines anti-Semitism only as criticism of Israel. It's the only one they care about. Although technically, if you force them, they'll criticize the occasional right wing or two, especially once the right wing has been pilloried by other organizations. Although when somebody says Free Palestine, the ADL is right at the forefront, immediately denouncing them. Um, I don't think any of you who followed my work need to be reminded of my views on the ADL. The truth is, though, that Rhodes makes a really important point here about how this collapsing of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism um, does, in fact, increase the danger of anti-Semitism. Normalizing these conspiracy theories is exactly what that does. The Trump administration's relentless claims that Israel's critics are anti-Semitic also obscure the danger posed by the ascent of right-wing ethno-nationalisms across the West. If you believe a 19-year-old Jewish college student chanting "Free Palestine" is more dangerous than the Vice President of the United States implying that Germans should embrace the far-right party Alternative for Germany, which, by the way, Vance did not imply, he outright said it, then you're drawing the wrong lessons from history. Goddamn right. Damn right. Um, I love the fact that Rhodes, points out that so many of the so-called anti-Semites are Jewish. And of course, this glib and lazy analysis from the right that says, well, they're just self-hating Jews, of course, thrown at me all the time. Um, it first of all, it elides Jewish history. It elides especially Jewish history on the left from the time of the Haskalah on, and all that Jews have done and contributed, because all of those people approached these questions from a universalist standpoint, not from uh, a Jewish specific standpoint, which is the point here. That 19-year-old Jewish college student chanting Free Palestine is doing that because she believes that that the Palestinian child is worth just as much as a Jewish child, and that the Palestinian and Jewish children are worth as much as Ethiopian children, are worth as much as Chaldean children, as Chinese children, as Dutch children, all children. And this is how you get absurdities like somebody like the wonderful Miss Rachel being accused of being anti-Semitic. So to bring this full circle and to kind of wrap this up, um, Rhodes talks about the political risks being overstated, and he's correct. Large majorities of Jewish Americans continue to vote for Democrats in recent elections, despite the fact that Republicans relentlessly sought to use Israel as a wedge issue. By taking the moral high ground, the Democratic Party could bring new voters into its coalition and show that it understands the times we are living through. Voters want authentic leaders willing to take principled stands, leaders willing to fight for them and against corrupt strongmen wherever they are. I mean, I think that's a really good place for us to land here too. The fact of the matter is, supporting universal rights is good politics. It's also good policy, and the fact that it's good policy is more important. But the fact that it's good politics makes it easier to do. If Democrats want to actually move forward, and this is true, by the way, far beyond the Israel-Palestine issue. This is true. This is what Democrats have realized about affordability. They want to talk about affordability like, oh, your next bag of groceries will be cost $5 less. That's not what affordability is. Affordability is reining in corporate price gouging. It is reining in the massive real estate land grabs that have happened all over the country that make it impossible for people to either buy homes or even rent them anymore. It does mean embracing a stronger social safety net. All of these things save money, by the way. All of these things contribute to a stronger economy. We can talk about all of them. It's not limited there. Democrats have for years run away from the question of immigration and used Republican talking points in a somewhat nicer way. They don't want you to pull a teacher out of her classroom or a mother away from her children. Uh, that that's not the point. The point is that immigrants are human beings. That's the point. And they should be treated as human beings. And many of them are seeking asylum, and many of them are refugees from countries we are responsible for devastating economically for decades. All of these things need to be part of a democratic ethic. It doesn't have to be the radical vision that I might embrace, but it does have to be a vision of basically decency, just basic decency and fairness and justice, at least to some extent. And I think this is where Palestine has become such an iconic issue. It's not. People say, why do you keep talking about Palestine? Why do you keep talking about Palestine? Because Palestine has come to symbolize all of these points. That's the issue. That's the reason. You know, that is what we need to address. And I think to some extent, Ben Rhodes realizes this, and that is evident in his op-ed. He has farther to go, and so does this thinking. Um, he needs to recognize some of the flaws that I pointed out here, I think, and, kind of embrace the notion that we all need to live in equality, whether we're in the United States or we're in Israel or we're in Gaza or wherever. He's not quite there yet, but he's getting there, and he deserves a lot of credit for having published this op-ed. So if you found this of value, please like, please subscribe. This is how I make my living. So if you can support this work, it is deeply appreciated. And I will talk to you soon.